Well, thank you for having me. I mean, it is such an honor and a pleasure to be joining everyone. I kind of sneaked in earlier because I wanted to listen to some of the panels that were happening, and I'm a big fan of a number of the people that were sharing information. And it's such a blessing, I should say, to be able to move into the space in these very tough times with folks who are committed to making change happen, committed to, no matter what the situation is, to navigating that and to trying to find ways to pull our country together. We have those folks who continually try and pull us apart, but also to be very mindful of the fact that, we've made some mistakes in the past, right? And there's been some intentionality in those. And then there's been other times that, out of lack of education or experience, that we've also had some problems that have developed out of that. I never thought that in the almost 30 years that I've been doing this work that I would have to open up any session by saying that science is real, because it's amazing. We are actually raised. We go to school and they tell us, do well in math, do well in science. And those are usually sort of the foundational elements that we're taught to do, along with English, of course. But we're in a moment now where we have to just reinforce and remind folks how incredibly important science is, and how, when it's done properly, that it can actually help us to move in a very positive direction. And when we don't honor it, or when it's not done in a way that's inclusive, then it can cause great harm and pain. And we're all very aware of that as well. When I talk about the work that I do, I have to anchor it in the reality of our past, so that as we are in our present moments and moving forward to a very bright future, if we do the right things, so that we don't forget. In these challenging moments, there are also opportunities. And being a student of history, I always look to the past to understand, how do we navigate some of these things. We know that it's very interesting, because I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, but there was a time in the history of our country when people said that women would never have the right to vote. And the women's suffrage movement, and sisters said, oh yeah, I got something for you. They, in partnership with others, and I heard partnerships talked about a lot in the earlier sessions, figured out a way to bring education, to marshal power, and to hold people accountable. And you have to remember that folks said that that would never happen. Now, we still have a long way to go to make sure that there's true equality for women in our society and across the planet. But there is an example, if you will. There is, this paradigm of how success can actually happen. We've seen the exact same thing, as it relates to African Americans. And we know, the brutality that was a part of slavery. But we also know, during the civil rights movement and folks coming out of Jim Crow, that it took a lot of people coming together to say, we can and will make change happen. And even connected to, additionally, to the work that we do, in the environmental and climate space, the early environmental movement, if you want to go to the late 60s and the early 70s, when we finally got some of our landmark pieces of legislation in place, there were many detractors at that time. There were detractors because sometimes folks get comfortable with the way things are, even when you can't see the sky, even when rivers are catching on fire. But there also was a number of other folks, and there were a lot of young people at that time. There may be a couple who are on our event today who were a part of that incredible work that had to happen, that transformation that was so critical to be able to get to a point where we have basic protections in place. And yes, we will talk a little bit about the dismantling of those basic protections. But the more important part is that people came together and they were able to help to make and push for real change to actually happen. And it reminds me of this moment that we're in, because policy, and I heard so many people talking about policy is critical to making change happen. And when policy is not done right, as we have seen in the past, so we know in many instances how restrictive covenants is and redlining and bad zoning practices have unfortunately created many of these situations that many of us now see ourselves working on to try and rectify, but not just rectify, but then to be able to move to a much brighter place, if you will, where we are pulling people in. Now, I heard folks also talking about, science and our relationship in many instances, those who are in institutions, those who are in academic settings as well. And it was great to hear that some folks were also raising the fact that communities have to be a part of that process. So folks often say, well, Mustafa, how were you able to be successful? And, we can sort of evaluate, if I have been successful and the movement has been successful, because my paradigm is that if one person is getting sick, if one person is losing their lives, then we haven't been successful. We may have been taking a step moving forward in the right direction, but we still got a lot to do. So I often use this as my formula. If Mr. Johnson or Mrs. Ramirez doesn't get it, then we have some work to do. And if Mrs. Johnson or Mrs. Ramirez or Mr. O'Leary is not asking us to do something, then we have to ask the question, why are we doing it? Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, but that does mean that there's some work that needs to be done in helping people to understand the value added and whatever those sets of actions might be. And we have seen over time, when we exclude people, when we disinvest in certain communities, these situations that in many instances go from being acute situations to chronic situations. So we find ourselves now in a COVID-19 moment. We find ourselves also now in what some have labeled as racial unrest, if we can say it that way. I'm not sure that that's the proper framing for the moment that we're currently in, but we should ask ourselves also, well, how did we get to this situation and the impacts that are happening from climate change? And sometimes for those of us who are working on things that are connected or maybe deeply, anchored to those issues, then we have to also look at our history and how we got here. So we know that we've had disinvestment in communities of color. We also know, and many of you are working on these issues of trying to rectify these past injustices, we know that when it comes to communities of color, lower wealth communities, and on indigenous brothers and sisters lands, that we have traditionally placed everything that no one else wanted. We know that there are certain parts of town, and not in the not so distant past, where we didn't hook folks up to the right types of water systems or to sewage systems because their communities were seen as less than. We are all working to try and change that paradigm, if you will. And we're doing it not just because it's altruistic. We're doing it not just because it makes our communities and our country and our planet, stronger. We're doing it because it literally can help to save our lives. It helps to save our lives because when we closed our eyes to the fact that many of these fossil fuel facilities were being located disproportionately in African American communities and Latinx communities, and lower income white communities, then we also put ourselves in this very, very dangerous situation because not only are those communities dealing with the toxic exposures, these chronic long-term, conditions, these health conditions that folks are finding themselves in, there's also playing a big role in the warming up of our planet and of our oceans. And we don't have to say anything more than seeing the wildfires that are currently going on and have been going on. And then we also know the role that these increased temperatures play in Hurricane Sally and Hurricane Katrina and Maria and so many others. All of that can be tied back to some of the impacts that are coming from those air pollutions that's going on, and our transportation routes, which we often forget to talk about, and how it separated communities and brought wealth to certain communities, extracted wealth from others, and then unfortunately dumped off pollution in those communities. And many of you are working to try and rectify that. When we talk about resiliency and adaptation and many of the things that we're working on and trying to get better water quality, all of this, is tied back to, for me, our most vulnerable communities. When we have 24 million people who are living in food deserts. Imagine that in the wealthiest country on the planet. How is it possible that we've got that many people who are living in food insecure areas? How is it that we have 2 million people who do not have access to water or sewage? And many times they're in rural locations. And most folks who know me, and I see some of the names on the screen, you know, I grew up in Appalachia and a little bit in Michigan. Yes, there are dreadlocks in Appalachia, so let's just be clear about that. But we have to get back to the basics. And I know I only have a short amount of time, so I'll go a little bit faster for folks. I want you to remember something. You know, the environmental justice movement started because there was not a seat at the table in the environmental and conservation movement. And folks had to, you know, create their own institutions to be able to address the issues that were going on inside of their communities. And I wish I had a time machine. Imagine if we could take people back 40 years and we could point them to the first People of Color Summit, which was actually in 1991. And the first principle of environmental justice is honoring Mother Earth. Imagine if that was one of the, you know, criteria that we used in our work, in our lives, how different our planet and our country would be at this moment. So knowing that these are our foundational elements that we're working from, and honoring our indigenous brothers and sisters who have been sharing with us for hundreds of years that water is life, we now have this moment that we're addressing some of these very egregious situations that are going on the federal level and sometimes on the state level. But as we begin to have a quick conversation about policy, I want everybody to do me a favor. I want everybody to just take a deep breath and hold it just for a few moments and let it out. I want you to remember that when you see folks on your TV screens talking about, I can't breathe, or we can't breathe, the reality of that situation is that yes, we have some police officers who unfortunately have taken the lives of Black and brown men and women, but we're also talking about the injustices that have happened inside of our most vulnerable communities. And we also know, for all of us who've worked on these, you know, environmental and conservation issues, that we have some really significant challenges that are also happening in the water space. And someone once said, well, Mustafa, why did you go to NWF of all places? You left the Hip Hop Caucus and you went to the National Wildlife Federation. Well, it was really simple, because that same pollution that is killing wildlife and injuring wildlife and in our natural spaces is that same pollution that is killing Black and brown and lower wealth white communities across our country. And that's also that same pollution that we should call out. There was a study last year that showed that 96% of our national parks were dealing with air pollution in a number of different ways. So lots of times we are separated on these issues when really it's all connected, and we have a chance to actually address that. Now, let's be honest, we know that we've got an administration right now that, as we said before, doesn't really place a whole lot of value in science. And of course, we understand that when you can manipulate science, then you can manipulate policy. And if you can manipulate policy, then you can move resources to the places that, you know, an administration hypothetically might see, as someone who's more supportive of that agenda. So we're not going to get political here, but, you know, there is a connection between science and policy and the actions that come out. And we know that over 100 environmental and climate and public health and conservation related laws have either been rolled back or weakened, and a number of these other things that just don't make sense. And they don't make sense because we all know that in many instances, the reason we work so hard is because they provide basics, the basic protections. You know, sometimes people will try and make things sound like they're the Cadillac or the Ferrari of whatever. And we understand that in many instances, we're dealing with the Fords and the Chevys of protection. And we're working to enhance that and make it stronger so that everybody's protected. And the reason that we do that is we know that 100,000 people are dying prematurely from air pollution every year. That's more people are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. That's more people are dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. And there's a laundry list of other examples. but we also know that there are a lot of really great folks who are coming together and understanding this holistic approach that's necessary. And the beauty of listening to folks earlier is that we understand now that we have to have a comprehensive approach to housing and to transportation and to our environment and to our public health and a number of other areas that have left gaps, but are also the drivers of making real change happen. And, you know, we have some really great opportunities right now. I'm really blessed that I get the opportunity to work with folks on Capitol Hill and the state houses and sometimes on the local level. And there are all of these new laws that are being introduced. And that's the first step. Some folks will get caught up on the fact, well, this might not pass right now. Well, that's okay if it doesn't pass right now, because it gives you the chance to make it smarter and better, and you get a chance to pull more people in so that whatever you get, and hopefully it's in a bipartisan fashion whenever it can be, so that you're getting the best ideas from everyone. And then you're having an opportunity to actually run it through the system of the folks who are going to hopefully not be hit first and worst, but will be the ones who actually can benefit the most from the changes that we're trying to make. And you guys have some, you know, there are some incredible examples out there of how folks are trying to move forward. I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but if you look at whether you're someone who is a supporter of the Green New Deal, or if you're somebody who is a supporter of some of the successes of the past with the CCC movement from the Roosevelt administration, we know that that gives us some real opportunities to actually make sure that the areas who have been unseen and unheard actually not only have a voice, but they have a chance to take advantage of the economic opportunities that can help us to make real change happen. And I'm one who believes that we can create economic opportunities, we can improve public health, and we can improve the environment. And one of the ways that we do that, of course, is through our natural systems and getting folks not only more connected to it, but also understanding that there are huge opportunities. If you look at the work of the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina, they took a $20,000 grant and leveraged into almost $300 million in changes, and is community driven by a community that was labeled as the other side of the tracks. And all of us have lived or been to places where folks have been labeled that way. Real change can actually happen. I really like also a good friend of mine, Scott Gilmore, who's there in Denver. Many folks know Scott. Scott is something else. I hope he's watching. You know, Scott, one time when I was out in Colorado, took me over to the reserve. And we walked that land, and I got a chance to see the bison, and I got a chance to see all the other wildlife that was there. And I also remember as a student and a little bit further down the road about, you know, going over how that was such a toxic site at one time. And Scott and others had shared with me how the community that was right there never had the opportunity to ever be able to, you know, take advantage of what was happening just a few feet away. And now it is such it's a space that is inviting, right? And that's really what we want to create. When we're talking about urban parks, or if we're talking about some of our other natural spaces, we're really talking about finding a way that folks feel comfortable and they feel invited so that there is ownership in that space. And that's what we're trying to do, is to make sure that people understand that they have power and that their power can translate into real positive changes inside of their community. And that's why it's so great to be in this circle today, because folks are focused. They understand when we're talking about tree canopies, we're talking about a whole bunch of different benefits that folks can get. When we're talking about, you know, the rebuilding, whether it is of our riverbanks or streams, or if somebody's on the coast, we understand the multiple benefits that are in there, but we have to make sure that equity is honored, because in many instances, folks have been forgotten. Folks haven't been invited into that space, and folks haven't been sort of framing out the direction. And we now have a chance to make real change happen. So I know I'm short on time, and y'all know I usually talk for about an hour to an hour and a half, but I want to remind you of this. Dr. King once shared with us, and folks have heard me share this before, one of his less famous quotes, which in my estimation should be one of his most famous quotes, is that he said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. I want you to think about that in reference to the challenges that we know we're going to have to deal with in relationship to the climate emergency and the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. but also in the fact that we can actually address any challenge that comes our way if we are willing to, one, leave our privilege at the door and realize that we're all in this together, that we all bring different gifts and blessings to the process. That changes the dynamic when folks know that they're honored and that they're valued. So with that being said, and I hope I didn't go over time, I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali. Thank you all so much for the work that you continue to do. Thank you for honoring both rural and urban spaces. And thank you for also making sure that you're not just thinking critically about what real authentic collaboration looks like, but putting it into practice. I promise you we can make change happen. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. It's a real honor to have you with us. And we look forward to finding more ways to work together and build on the good work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you.